With Karen Strawn. She is the chief spokesperson for Men's and Rights Edmonton, specifically, but she's actually fairly well known and one of the top spokespeople in general for men's and human rights movements. She has a blog called Owning Your Shit, which is a title I enjoy. She has a YouTube channel called Girl Writes What, and she co-hosts a weekly show called Honey Badger Radio. Now, a lot of the people in the audience have asked us to talk to men's rights advocates. That is exactly what we're doing here. Now, sometimes on the show...
What's up, YouTube? Today, we are covering a debate of Karen Strawn, who had she had a debate with a pro-feminist news reporter. Yep, I'm a passport bro discovering that. So, let's get into it, shall we?
Such advocates on a case-by-case basis. That doesn't mean this is going to be a debate. This is going to be an informational expedition. Okay? Karen, thanks for joining us on the Young Turks. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
What exactly is men's rights? What does that mean?
There are certain issues where men's rights are sort of routinely violated, at least on as far as an equality basis. There are certain situations men can find themselves in where they have essentially no due process, particularly domestic violence and sexual assault cases, where you can be put in jail without any kind of due process at all, or you can be kept from your home. And those types of things, while the laws tend to be gender neutral, they do disproportionately affect men. There's also there's some legal rights that men lack. The right to genital integrity is one of the big ones, and it's sort of a bone of contention among some in this movement, because there are some people who believe that circumcision should be banned, and then there are others who don't feel that way. But it is a very common complaint in the movement that circumcision is still legal and socially acceptable, while female genital mutilation is protected. It's banned under federal law in pretty much every Western country. There are fathers' rights issues that need addressing. There is a very large sentencing gap under the same conditions, in the same circumstances, committing the same crimes. Men are twice as likely to be incarcerated, and they serve generally 60 to 65% longer sentences. That's a wider gap than between blacks and whites in the U.S. So, I mean, there are a whole host of issues that deal with legal and legislative problems and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then there are social issues that need to be addressed, social issues of sexism and stuff like that. So,
you know, as you explain that whole penumbra of issues that men's rights deals with, it seems to me, as I suspected, that there are some things that clearly need addressing and some things that people are probably unaware of. You know, the sentencing points that you made are really interesting, and I'd like to know more about that, and I'll look into that more. And, you know, parental rights for men, you know, issues about how assets are split during a divorce. Those are all super interesting. I mean, there's a story in the news today about how Ken Griffin, who's a billionaire out of Chicago, is getting divorced, and his wife is demanding $1 million a month.
yeah.
Because her 3 children have grown accustomed to the lifestyle of having not one, but 2 private jets at their disposal.
Yeah, no, and it's not just $1 million. It's $1 million plus extraordinary expenses like fueling the jets and travel expenses and stuff like that, right? And,
they all sound like extraordinary expenses to me.
Well, but you look at it too when women, occasionally very wealthy women, get dinged with having to pay that kind of alimony. There's a huge outcry, and there's all kinds of, like, how dare you treat a woman the way we've been treating men all along, right? That's unfair, right? It's suddenly unfair when it's the other way around. And I'm hoping that as more women end up having to pay alimony, that'll be.
Personally, I don't think as a passport bro, I don't think it's unfair at all. I think it's literally what feminists have been saying they wanted. for several decades now, which is equality. Yeah, but isn't it kind of funny how whenever equality, when I hear the responsibility part of equality, that's when they immediately fly to the traditional gender roles. Not the benefits of equality, but when you hear the responsibility part of it. That's when we see so many feminists run and fly to traditional gender roles. They do.
It is the political will to do away with it, at least in terms of indefinite or lifetime alimony in states like Florida. So
Right. So I think that there's a lot that we can agree on issues like that. On the other hand, I'm not sure that I agree on some of the other things that you mentioned, but that's why we want to talk this through and see where
There
we
you
stand
go.
on things. Okay. So when you say let's just take the right to genital integrity first. I'm amused by that language, but so do you? It's a wrong way of saying it. Do you understand? Do you agree that female genital mutilation and circumcision are not the same thing? That there is a legitimate reason to do a male circumcision, which is health. Now, you might disagree on that. And I think a lot of people strongly disagree on whether there are good health reasons or not, but that's the main reason to do it. Whereas female genital mutilation, there is absolutely, positively no health consequences other than dire ones, and no benefits whatsoever, and it's done simply for the honor of old customs and the pleasure of men, theoretically, etc. Like that, there's a big difference there.
There are differences for sure. Some forms of FGM are actually less severe than the typical circumcision, less damaging, less permanent, and others, of course, are much worse. But one of the issues around that is that you can actually find studies that have been done in places like Yemen and stuff like that, where FGM is still practiced, that show the exact same health benefits. A decrease in urinary tract infections, and a decrease in sexually transmitted infections and stuff like that. One of the things that most people don't know is that at least sort of secular communities in the U.S. in particular, circumcision began as a health issue, but it began during the nervous excitation theory of disease before we learned about germs and stuff like that. It was promoted by the guy who invented cornflakes, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, I believe. And it was promoted as a way of preventing masturbation, because masturbation was viewed back then to contribute to mental illness and epilepsy and spina bifida and spinal cord diseases and paralysis and all kinds of things like that. And you can find justifications, you can find medical papers all through the history that that circumcision cures mental illness, circumcision cures epilepsy, circumcision cures this, it cures that, it cures paralysis, spinal paralysis, it cures all of these things. So it really has been, at least in the sort of the secular community or the non-Jewish, non-Muslim communities, it has been a cure searching for a disease the whole time. Mm-hmm. And so there really is there's no explicit or definite health benefit
Okay.
that you can provide as far as circumcising a minor child. That's really the thing. I think that any man should have the choice to do that. But 4-day-old babies don't have sex. They're not going to get STIs. The urinary tract studies, because most full-term babies were circumcised at the time, the uncircumcised ones were generally preemies in the study. And so, of course, they're going to be more susceptible to urinary tract infections and other health problems.
All right. Karen,
these
are
just,
I don't want to spend too much time on that.
There you go.
I got it. I mean.
Okay. Now, everybody, something I want to point out here. Notice how much she brings up all the evidence that shows that, hey, your idea on this subject of men is wrong. All the evidence. Instead of wanting to counter it with his evidence, He just wants to shut down the subject. And that is a very typical thing we see a lot of feminists and their simp pro supporters do, which is, hey, whenever we bring up evidence that completely demolishes your argument, saying that, hey, about your argument against men, instead of trying to continue to debate it, they want to shut it down, silence it. Like I once met a man, a simp. I'm not going to name names here. I'm not going to name names, for YouTube channel purposes, where he made a very biased joke towards me, where he says, hey, it's very typical for men to take credit for what a woman did. I said, well, with respect, women do that too. He says, no, I don't. I said, dude, look around you. Every one of these buildings you see here were built by men. They were. And instead of trying to counter that argument, he shuts us down saying, Matthew, let's not go there. That's entirely sexist. Honestly, I wanted to tell him, dude, the definition of sexist is judging people based on the sex that you were born as, which is why we see so many simps and feminists do on a routine, everyday basis. But that moment aside, why bother? I already know he's not going to listen to me. I already know that. But yeah, that's what happened. That's the very factual difference between what's the anti-feminist, men's rights, and passport bros versus our feminist counterparts and the sim counterparts, which is when we make an argument, we bring facts, actual evidence. When feminists and their simp supporters, like this one, see that, they run away or they try to silence it. They do, in whatever way they shape or form they can. Now, personally, I've been working at the heart of the hospital as a sterile processing technician for several decades now. And I'm going to tell you straight up, any practice or surgical procedure that took place before the study of germs, you don't want to have any part in it. You don't. I'm not telling you to not go do it. It's completely up to you. But I'm telling you, as a person who works at the heart of the hospital, those practices, they carry so much risk. It's not worth it. It really is not.
That it has the same implications and that it's done for the same reasons. But I understand the things that you're laying out. People can decide on their own whether they're in favor of circumcision or not. But if it was intended to cure masturbation, I can assure the audience that it has not worked.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
It really doesn't.
Okay,
no.
All right. But I mean, all right, I don't want to get back into it, but female genital mutilation is clearly to oppress women. Clearly. Whereas circumcision is not nearly as clear if it's even in that direction, which even if I granted that to you, it's certainly not like a worldwide thing like let's oppress men by circumcising them. So.
Okay. Now here's a lie I want to completely debunk for all of you, where he says female mutilation is clearly to oppress women. It's not. I worked at the heart of the hospital as a sterile processing technician for many years now. I really have. And I want to tell you straight up, before any doctor can perform a surgery on somebody, even before a brand new surgery can be done on a human being, it has to go through so many channels to get approved. FDA, CDC, EPA. It has to go through all these agencies in order to get approved. If female mutilation was designed to oppress men, it wouldn't have passed through all these different agencies. It really would not have. So, female mutilation is not to oppress women. It's not. Any surgery that's been done in the hospital gets approved through multiple different agencies, and it does not get approved for the purpose of oppressing someone else. It doesn't.
Well, I mean, look at it this way: if it originated in order to suppress male sexuality, then one might actually come to the conclusion that it is there to control the behavior of men.
I mean, the last thing I'll say on that is that religion wants to oppress all of our sexuality. So we can certainly agree on that. Okay, now let's back up a little bit and talk about general things, because I'm curious, where you come at it from a wider look at this. So there's a lot of talk about feminists in your writing, and I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same things here, because do you grant that feminists for a long time did great work in getting women rights that they clearly did not have, and that today there might be a strand of radical feminism that you disagree with, and I would be surprised if I didn't disagree with, but that there's a distinction between those two different branches of feminism?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. I mean, if you look at even their advocacy right from the very beginning, so this would be even before women suffrage and all of that. And you look at a cultural norm such as sort of default father custody after divorce, which is the way things used to be done. And the reason why they were done that way is because the man had the sole financial responsibility for taking care of the children. And if he was at fault for the marriage breakdown, he would continue to have financial responsibility for taking care of his ex-wife in the form of alimony. But he would still have the children because it was his job to take care of them. That was he was solely responsible for that. And you had activists like Carolyn Norton in the UK around the 1850s or so complaining that this situation really didn't serve women's happiness. And it was mostly talk around what would make women happy and how it was unfair to women that they were made so unhappy after a divorce because they lost their children. So they convinced the British government to change the laws and policies into something called the tender years doctrine. And what that did was it switched to everything to default mother custody. But at the same time, they kept the entire bill on the man. And now, even if a woman was at fault for the marriage breakdown, she would get custody of the kids, and he would be responsible for paying her alimony. That's what child support was sort of lumped in together with it, because it was his responsibility still to support the household of his children, right? So you sort of had this transfer of rights without a transfer of...
Personally, as possible, bro, I think that default for men getting custody makes more sense than default for women getting custody. Because let's face it, if the man is paying all the bills for this kid, if he really is, if he's paying for everything, if he's paying for a household through alimony, you have to admit, like, in that household environment, if the child will be raised by the father, the child is going to learn responsibility, and will also learn the value of money. Where in a household where, like, hey, mom's not paying for anything, she's not, ex-father is, he's paying for everything, that child is not going to learn any responsibility at all. That child just won't. That child is also not going to learn the value of money either. He just won't. Or she won't. Yeah. So that goes into evidence how single fathers are better than the single mothers, because single fathers teach their children responsibility. They do.
And as far as I know, those responsibilities did not begin to swing the other way until equal rights legislation came around in the 1960s, right? So you look at how they changed things, right? I do believe that there needed to be a renegotiation of gender roles and a renegotiation of the rights and responsibilities of men and women. But in so many cases, what tended to happen was feminists managed to get rights for women without the attendant responsibilities that went along with those things for men. And what feminists would call the default father custody that occurred before feminism, they would call that male patriarchal privilege, right? Whereas nowadays, if you even suggest that, men should not be forced to pay child support, even for kids that were born out of wedlock, that they had no say in whether they would be born, that's considered unfair, right? That the woman who has the custody should have the entire responsibility. That's unfair to those women. Yet when it was men that got custody and responsibility, that was privilege, right? So I mean, they've really renegotiated things in such a way that women received a lot of rights and kept the responsibilities on the male half of the equation. And
So,
that's
Karen,
what I've always taken issue with.
So, Karen, I get that, and that's certainly an interesting point historically and today, as we discussed in the beginning. Custodial rights is some of the things that I think you guys have the best points on. But
there you go.
But when we talk about the history of feminism, women weren't allowed to own property. Men got to make all the decisions in the household. They got to make all the business decisions. They weren't even allowed to vote. Since you're a woman, Karen, I assume.
Okay, let's cut things right here and now. There were plenty of women in history worldwide who owned property and were also in very serious leadership positions. For example, Queen of Egypt, I forget her name, she married Julius Caesar, or Nefertiti, that was her name. Nefertiti, Queen of Egypt, married Julius Caesar. Guess what? That marriage ended as fast as it began, and literally took the entirety of the Roman Empire, and pretty much the Egyptian Greek Empire with it, and literally caused us to be put into the Dark Ages. Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, whose leadership caused the Great Famine in France. It did. The hunger famine that France was going through. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a modern-day feminist, who, by the way, we all know her history. You know what I find very common what every one of these women have? The feminist movement towards reaction to every one of these women? Is that they want to point out all their great feats, but they don't want to point out the negative stuff that happened because it doesn't fall within their narrative. Or, for example, Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France, and she created a great hunger famine, and she had the leadership position. She had the ability to make all these decisions within the household. She did. But she did not just the household, but the entire country. But she wanted nothing to do with the responsibilities. This caused the people of France to peacefully protest at first. But when Marie Antoinette decided the response to that protest by saying, hey, if they cannot have bread, they can have cake. Okay, that caused things that got really out of hand with that. Pretty much a full-scale revolution. Yeah. Nefertiti. She married Julius Caesar for a position of power, but she failed to neglect to understand, like, hey, if I gave Caesar this position of power by becoming Queen of Egypt, will that corrupt Julius Caesar? She didn't really think about that at all, and it did. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a woman we all know, she's on the headlines, who played a very key role in the January 6th insurrection. Now, Karen, I understand that a lot of people say that Donald Trump was the one who caused the January 6th insurrection, and I can see that because, like, hey, it was technically done for him. It was. But one thing I wanted to point out here, when it comes to that thing about the January 6th insurrection, is that it's been several years now since that day has happened, and to this exact day, I have yet to see any public evidence be presented from the January 6th Insurrection Committee pointing out any real direct involvement Donald Trump had within the January 6th insurrection. Well, don't get me wrong, they said a lot of things he supposedly said behind the scenes, but I have yet to see any evidence be brought to the public's eye about his direct involvement in promoting that insurrection. Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the other hand, we have seen multiple pieces of evidence be brought to the public of her promoting that January 6th insurrection. Multiple pieces. She was really the key promoter for it. She was. Now we fast forward to that 4B movement, which was a movement of feminists doing, while fully engaging, in literally the exact same behavior that started the January 6th insurrection, aka refusing to accept election results. And let's face it, everybody, the feminist movement has a very large track record of speaking for people on their behalf without their permission. They have a very large track record of offering help when people have never asked for it. And they have a very large track record of pinning the blame of all their mistakes and all their problems onto men. So it doesn't really take much to connect the dots here and figure out what really happened. It really doesn't. So, point being, there are plenty of women in leadership positions. There are plenty of women who are able to own properties in history. However, feminists do not want to point that out. They do not.
Feminists got you the right to own property, the right to vote, etc.
Again, with the property issue, that was a little bit one-sided too, because under coverture, a woman who was single was considered femme sole, and she had every right to own property and earn income in her own name, and to enter into contracts under her own name. This was the way it was for a single woman. She could own a business, whatever, right? For a married woman, because the responsibility for her financial well-being, all of the responsibility for the entire family was seated in the husband and father. Because of that, of course he had authority within the family, right? Of course he had the authority to decide how the money was spent. And another thing that feminists managed to do between the 1850s and the 1910s across most of the West was they emancipated women's property and income, not just from her husband, but from the entire institution of family, right? So it was still his responsibility to pay for everything. And her income was her own to do with as she wished. She was still entitled to his support, even if she made more money than him. And that even went all the way down to the tax burden on her property and income. That was not her responsibility to pay. That was his responsibility to pay, right? And at that time, women won the right, even when married, to enter into contracts. So they could enter into contract with anybody, but most lenders were not stupid. They knew that they could not hold this woman accountable for her debt because it was her husband's job to pay for everything, right? And if she didn't have a husband, it could end up falling on her father or her brother, right?
Karen.
They would require a co-signer. This was seen to be, vastly unfair, but there was a reason for it, right?
Karen.
And the reason was it was the man who was ultimately accountable for repaying the debt.
So I understand all that, and I think that you're generally making the case that the pendulum swung too far in giving unequal rights to women at some point. But even before the cases that you're referring to, women could, whether single or not, couldn't own any property. And now at this point,
I think you'd have to really look into that. I think you really would, because there were in the 1430s there were female master blacksmiths on the roster in London.
So Karen,
in the guilds.
Yes, it depends on the time period, the culture you're talking about, and how far back you go. Right? There's no blanket answer, so it depends.
Of course there isn't, but people
overall,
like to say blanket statements
Karen,
like women couldn't own property. Well, that's just not the case.
But Karen, for Christ's sake, you have to concede that men certainly had, throughout history, far more ability to own property and to be the masters of their own fate in terms of finance than women. You've got to concede that, right?
Certainly.
Okay.
Certainly that is certainly true.
Okay, good. All right. So now, aren't we in a vastly better situation, even if it isn't nearly perfect, today than we were in those years, and it's because of the hard work of women who got those rights for other women?
Well, like I said, I would have been much happier if they'd done it in a more equal way. One of the things that has happened is that we've come to consider certain things to be normal, like sort of the idea of a man being declared a default. He's the default father declared in court because he didn't contest paternity in the first 30 days after the child was born. There's a man who's facing jail in Michigan right now because he refuses to pay the $30,000 of back child support he supposedly owes for a child that isn't even his. And we've sort of come to see this this enforcement of responsibilities on men who sometimes had nothing to do with anything, like somebody who is not even the father of the kid, as just the new normal, right? It's
not just the new normal as men, it's also the new normal in schools too. Like, for example, when I was in school, I had a female student who made complaints towards me to the teacher about, say, how I made her feel uncomfortable. And I tried pointing out, hey, if you look at both of our class schedules, you're going to notice it's physically impossible for me to have done any of this stuff. But instead of even looking at the class schedules, the teacher just said, madam, is what this boy is saying is true? Oh, no, that is not true. I'm like, why? Hey, hold on. All you have to do to confirm that if it's true or not is just look at our class schedules. Why aren't you looking at that? And then the female teacher just responded saying, we're not talking about her, we're talking about you. Yeah, the teacher literally declared me guilty till proven innocent for being born a boy. Even when the teacher had actual documentational evidence in hand that this female student was lying, she was committing the third-degree felony known as making a false claim with the intention of harm, this teacher didn't look at it. And now we fast forward today, even at my work location, hey, I'm not going to say names here, I'm not, for YouTube channel God purposes, but we had a situation at my work location where a woman was committing the third-degree felony towards a man known as making a false claim with the intention of harm. And I gotta tell you straight up, if I didn't start this YouTube channel, that male coworker of mine would have been declared guilty till proven innocent. However, because I started this YouTube channel, instead HR said, okay, this woman made all these complaints towards you, but we have no real means of proving that it actually happened. So you either go to work or you can leave. That's your choice. They didn't punish the female coworker, but instead what happened was things got, instead of the male coworker being fired, it got into a stalemate. Yeah, that's what happened. So yeah, YouTube channels like this are very important for that reason. They really are.
And these are things that can really destroy somebody's life. Now, one of the things that I always try to draw attention to is the fact that all of these things, all the way back to the beginning, to the 1850s, have been reformed in ways where in every sense, a woman gains privileges and a man loses them. So we really have it. It hasn't just, the pendulum has swung, but it's really, really, really gone too far. And when you look at some of the complaints of modern day feminists, and this is really what it is, like if it was just equal rights, if that's all it was about, I would consider myself a feminist if that's all that there was. But there's all kinds of baggage attached to it. There's all kinds of theoretical baggage and the feminist lens and a system of philosophies and a worldview and ideology that's all attached to that and underpins what they do. And those, I feel, the theories are highly toxic. I think that they promote discord, they promote fear between the sexes, they promote resentment, and they aren't good for anybody. So
Karen, look, when it gets to specific issues in the news, et cetera, we'll have to bring you back on and have further conversations. But just to round up this conversation, there's two other general points that I'd like to discuss. Look, when you talk about, if you say radical feminism or radical political correctness, there's another story out in the news today about how one of the city universities in New York is going to take away Mr. and Miss as titles because they think that it promotes gender inequality. How it does that, I have no idea, right? So do I think that there is a place for a men's rights movement to address how far the pendulum has swung and to address some of the issues where men are being treated unequally? Yes, I do. I want to make sure that the pendulum for men's rights movement doesn't swing so far that it becomes radical in the opposite direction. So, like, that's why I'm going to ask one more time on the issue of the right to vote. I mean, you can't just tar feminism with the brush of current day, some small strand of radical feminism. I mean, feminists got women the right to vote. Shouldn't you?
Okay, first of all, everybody, feminists did not get women the right to vote. I don't even think the feminist movement even existed during colonial times. The right for women to vote was a movement that was done by Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, a historical figure in American history, wanted women to have the right to vote, so she voted illegally. This created a huge debate, which is should women have the right to vote? The counter argument to that debate that people had a problem with was women wanted the right to vote, but they did not wanted the responsibility to go with it, which was to be signed up for selective services. Feminists did not give women the right to vote. They did not. In reality, you could say men gave women the right to vote. The reason why is because men invented democracy, which goes hand in hand with voting. And when women said, like Susan B. Anthony said, hey, we want this right to vote now, guess what? Men gave them the right to vote. Women asked for it, men gave them the right to vote. They did. Now let's fast forward now to current day time, where we see many court situations where, regardless of how strong a man's case is against a woman who abused him and stuff like that, he's ended up forcing to settle the case in a way that really should not have been settled in the first place. And the reason why is because when there are female jurors in there, the majority of those female jurors are going by the narrative the feminist movement promotes, which is if you betray or you don't support your fellow women, the feminist movement will turn on you. And there's no real way for us to factually identify that bias amongst our female jurors. And those types of female jurors get in there because they have the right to vote, regardless of whether or not they are feminist or not. Personally, I for one think if women want the right to vote, okay, sure. I think that's great. But I also think women should have the responsibility to go with it. If women were given these rights and the responsibility that goes with it, I think the majority of women here in the West would have a different perception of men. They would.
Thank you to them, not just because you're a woman, but also because for the sake of humanity, they did a great service to all of us?
Okay, well, there were two movements there, right? There was the suffragist movement, and then there was the suffragette movement. And the suffragist movement was interested in votes for everybody. And a lot of them really resented the suffragettes, particularly a lot of female suffragists resented the suffragettes because the suffragettes got up to all kinds of crazy stuff. They lobbed bombs, they burned post offices. I read an account in a man's diary from back then that they tried to push him off a cliff. Out of chivalry, he didn't report the attempted murder. They got into all kinds of criminal activities and stuff like that. You could even say they were domestic terrorists. And a lot of the suffragists were like, you're just demonstrating that women shouldn't have the vote. And a lot of public sentiment back then, and this is the history that we don't get told. A lot of public sentiment back then was, well, if this is how women behave, should they get the vote? And another thing, too, there were politicians in the UK who were discussing giving the women the vote long before the suffragettes started up. And
I'm sure, Karen, if they continue to ask politely, men would have given it to them anyway.
That's literally what happened. Historically speaking, women asked and complained for the right to vote. Men gave it to them. That's literally what happened. feminists did not give women the right to vote. Technically speaking, men gave women the right to vote because men invented democracy, which goes hand in hand with voting. You cannot have a right to vote without democracy, which was invented by men. That's a part of history you don't see any feminists want to talk about because they want to rewrite history to make women sound more oppressed than they actually are. Let's be honest, the only reason why feminists get to complain about men so much is because men gave these women literally everything, and they have shown no gratitude and no appreciation for it. Well, got news for you, ladies. If that's the way you truly feel about us, then you really have no real, and you're not in any real position to be complaining when so many men, like myself, decide to replace you with a woman from overseas. Because this is literally what you've been asking for. After all, how many times have we seen so many feminists say, we don't need men anymore, the future is female, all men should just leave? Okay, we'll leave. Bye.
Throughout history, I'm sure they would have just said, hey, women, even though we've denied you the right to vote for the entire history of mankind, literally mankind, if you just stuck around and been polite, we'd have given it to you anyway. Come on, Karen, you got to realize that's the biggest load of horse crap you've ever heard in your life.
They took a poll in England of women, and 70% of them didn't want the vote. They thought.
I know, and the women in Saudi Arabia want the burqa. I know, it's because of the culture that they grew up in. Karen, give me a thank you. Look, everything's going great, but you're not being reasonable. You're being ridiculous.
The one who's not being reasonable, sir, is you. Because you're exploding at the facts instead of creating a counter-argument. You are demanding that the woman who you gave an invitation to just agree with you. Yeah, that's what you're doing, sir. That is what the simp is doing. Now, let's be honest. Now, as a backtrack, if you guys weren't here when we went over what a simp is, the definition of a simp is, well, the historical term for it is someone who may have some seemingly well-founded reasons to be too afraid to say no to a hate movement. In this case, it's the male hate movement known as feminism. However, if you don't put your foot down and say no to it, you're going to go broke very quickly and very easily because you're wasting way too many of your resources on people, in this case feminists, who, by the way, just cannot be pleased long term. They just can't. There's always going to be something new to complain about. There will be. Anyways, that's all I have time for today. Carlene has arrived in the United States. We're about to get married now. And let's be honest here, everybody. If an average lunch bucket guy like me can become a passport bro and find a beautiful wife from overseas to get married to, hey, why can't you? Give it a try. Am I right? And any feminists out there, hey, I want to say if you want to get married, hey, all the power to you. I have no problem with it. However, you're going to have to stop blaming men for everything that. Let me backtrack. If you want to get, feminists want to get married, I have no problems with it. Hey, all power to you. However, you're going to have to get your act together and stop blaming men for everything that goes wrong in your life so you can offer men a better deal than what these women from overseas are offering us if we decide to become passport bros. Because that's literally what passport bros are. We have nothing against women, then we don't like the feminist movement, but we have nothing against it. We're just men who took a good hard look at what the local Western Denmark is offering, compared it to what the women from overseas have been offering us for life partners, and we just took the better offer. That's all it